The new decade began with the world dealing with the fallout that years of fighting had brought, while at the same time struggling with the aftermath of an influenza epidemic that killed over 20 million worldwide. This was more than twice as many as had lost their lives in the war itself. This so-called Spanish flu epidemic did not in fact originate in Spain at all, with the most widely accepted theory now tracing the 1918 influenza outbreak to the army camps of Kansas. This catastrophe was partly offset by the introduction of the BCG vaccine in 1921, inoculating a new post-war generation of children against the enduring scourge of tuberculosis. As a fragile post-war recovery began to take root, a profound political shift was taking shape. The war agreements in Paris had changed the world irreparably, bringing into being new countries from the ashes of the old defeated empires. Britain and France retained theirs and indeed gained from the defeat of Germany and the Ottoman Empire. But politically, the decade saw this new order waning, struggling as they went, especially hurt by American isolationism and its refusal to take an active role in international affairs through the League of Nations. In the East, the new communist regime in Russia was also no more than a spectator, but for other reasons. Lenin, with Trotsky and Stalin and others around him, faced a new struggle in the aftermath of 4 years of civil war that had left millions dead and millions more suffering from terrible poverty and famine. So after the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, was officially proclaimed in Moscow on the 30th of December 1922, Lenin in desperation was forced to turn to the new economic policy, the NEP, in order to feed his people. This was a limited return to capitalism that managed to restore agricultural production to pre-war levels by 1926. This was 2 years after the death of Lenin himself from a stroke, and came in the middle of a bitter leadership struggle between the left and the right of the party that was based on economics as much as political ideology, that was only resolved in 1928 in favor of Joseph Stalin. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the USA was to enjoy the boom years. Its economy had grown massively during the war, and this continued with the consumer boom that was marveled at around the world. The rise of mass production was at the heart of this, with industrial titans such as Henry Ford, whose assembly line techniques transformed American manufacturing, making goods that were widespread, popular, and cheap. The USA dominated post-war world trade, and its prosperity and success seemed even greater when it was compared with Europe. Yet this prosperity could not hide various tensions simmering beneath the surface. One surrounded prohibition, established by the 18th Amendment of the US Constitution that passed into law on the 16th of January 1919. But this also led to the huge growth in organized crime, with gangsters such as Al Capone in Chicago growing rich on the sale of illegal alcohol. By the end of the decade, Capone's business was making around $60 million annually, while between 1927 and 1930, some 500 gangland murders were reported. At the same time, Jim Crow laws across the Deep South kept the black population excluded from the political process, with this injustice driving what came to be called the Great Migration, as hundreds of thousands of African Americans left the rural South for northern cities such as Chicago, Detroit, and New York in search of work and basic rights denied them in the South. The population of Harlem in New York, for example, grew from about 90,000 in 1910 to over 200,000 in 1930, with these changes reshaping the culture and politics of these northern cities. But the decade also saw new political voices emerge in the United States, and these included that of Eleanor Roosevelt, whose early influence in democratic politics reflected broader changes taking place in American society. Beyond Britain and France, the remaining great powers of the 19th century, who had won their battle for the supremacy of Europe in 1917 and 1918, and the rising star of the 20th century, the United States, the tectonic plates of global power in other regions were shifting fast. Japan dominated Asian trade, and in the 1920s had risen to become one of the world's five most industrialized nations. This remarkable transformation had begun only 60 or so years before, in 1858, with the Harris Treaty that opened up several major ports to foreign residents and trade, including Yokohama and Nagasaki. It was nominally a democratic country, but the emperor and the army retained much of the power they had always traditionally held. Hirohito, who became Emperor of Japan on the 25th of December 1926, following the death of his father, was a central cog in this increasingly martial political structure. Japan's rise was helped by internal turmoil in China, where it had acquired a foothold in Manchuria earlier in the century. This turmoil centered on the conflict between the nationalists, the Kuomintang, led by Chiang Kai shek, Sun Yat sen's successor, and the marauding northern warlords who were only defeated, finally, in 1927. At the same time, Mustafa Kemal, the father of the Turks, defied treaty obligations that had been imposed on the Ottoman Empire in 1919 in Paris, defeating the occupying Greek army before renegotiating a new peace treaty with the Allies, who themselves did not have the military or political will to restart the First World War in the Eastern Mediterranean. Ataturk ruled as an autocrat, but transformed Turkey into a modern, secular, westernized state before his death in 1938. On the increasingly important peninsula of Arabia in 1924, Ibn Saud's forces launched their campaign against King Hussein, with whom Lawrence of Arabia had taken Aqaba and Jerusalem in the war. With the capture of Mecca, Jeddah, and Medina by late 1925, the king's land in the Hejaz was brought under Ibn Saud's control, and by 1932 he felt strong enough to formally proclaim the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. In 1936, the discovery of oil in the deserts of Arabia showed just how important the consequences of these early 1920s political developments were to be. In Persia in 1921, Colonel Reza Khan staged a coup against the government that was unpopular for accepting continued Russian and British influence. Becoming Shah in 1925, he embarked upon a program of modernization and was deeply influenced by European models of economic organization. He also suppressed the traditionally powerful Shiite religious leadership, who did not gain power until after the Iranian Revolution of 1979. Reza Khan was forced from power by Britain and the USSR, both of whom suspected him of being pro-German. In 1941, he was replaced by his son, who ruled Iran until Khomeini's return. In Europe, the Paris Peace Conference of 1919 created a number of new states, many of whom, by the time of the Munich Conference in the late 1930s, had fallen to some sort of right-wing populism. In Italy, resentment over their treatment at Versailles, as well as inflation and industrial unrest, pushed the country towards collapse. This persuaded Mussolini, the leader of the fascists, named after the fasces, a bundle of wooden rods tied together that was the symbol of power in ancient Rome, to organize the March on Rome in 1922. When the king refused to order a state of emergency called for by more democratic leaders, he invited Mussolini to form a government, with Italy becoming the first European country to fall to fascism. Mussolini took the title Il Duce and went on to lead Italy until he was strung up on an advertising hoarding by a petrol station in 1943. But nowhere were the consequences of the First World War felt more keenly than in Germany, with reparations pushing it towards bankruptcy. At the end of 1922, when payments fell short, French and Belgian soldiers marched into the Ruhr, triggering a year of crisis that was only resolved with massive American intervention. This decision was made by Raymond Poincaré, the new hardline anti-German French Prime Minister. In response, the German government ordered workers to strike and refused to make any industrial products, just for them to be sent straight over the border into France. The mark lost its value, and hyperinflation began, with a suitcase of banknotes, soon needed just to buy a loaf of bread. In November 1923, in this chaos, the Nazis, the NSDAP, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, a small fringe radical party based in Munich, Bavaria, led by Adolf Hitler, attempted to seize power in the Munich Putsch. This beer hall putsch was to be an unmitigated disaster, and Hitler was imprisoned for 5 years in relative comfort at Landsberg Castle, serving only 9 months, during which time he dictated Mein Kampf to Rudolf Hess. As the world moved into 1924, Gustav Stresemann took control and launched a new currency that calmed inflation. At the same time, he negotiated the Dawes Plan, which reduced reparations and secured foreign loans. French and Belgian troops left the Ruhr in 1925, and Germany entered the League of Nations in 1926. Meanwhile, in the aftermath of the Great War, a more optimistic type of global diplomacy was being tested around the world. At the Washington Naval Conference of 1921-22, delegates agreed limits on battleship numbers in the Pacific to avoid another naval arms race, while in 1927, over 60 countries signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact that denounced war as a means of settling disputes. But nothing symbolized the hope of the decade more than the treaty signed at Locarno in Italy in 1926. These were a bundle of 7 treaties that aimed to stabilize relations with Germany, especially by confirming its western borders with France and Belgium. Locarno brought a period of peace in Europe, sometimes called the Locarno honeymoon, a brief period of post-war optimism. Europe's economies felt the benefits, and Germany was welcomed back into the international community. For their efforts, Stresemann and Briand received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1926. While Europe worked towards peace, Britain faced a different set of pressures. The question of Ireland dominated the early 1920s, with Sinn Féin withdrawing its 73 MPs from Westminster in 1919 and setting up the Dáil in Dublin. At the same time, the IRA launched a guerrilla war, with this helping to bring about the Irish Free State in 1921. But civil war soon followed between pro-treaty forces under Michael Collins and anti-treaty forces aligned with Eamon de Valera. Women's political rights also advanced, with Emmeline Pankhurst living to see full suffrage granted in 1928. Across the empire, unrest echoed the same demand for change. In Egypt, riots forced Britain to grant independence in 1922, and in India, the shadow of earlier events, especially General Dyer's actions in the Amritsar massacre, continued to fuel nationalism. Gandhi's civil disobedience campaign shaped the decade, culminating in the Salt March of 1913. And while the empire strained abroad, Britain wrestled with economic tension at home. It had already endured a sharp post-war recession in 1920 and 21, with unemployment soaring and whole industries struggling to adjust to peacetime demand. The Liberal Party's failure to reunite after its wartime split drove its decline. Ramsay MacDonald had already shifted the political balance earlier in the decade, laying the foundations of what was to follow. His first Labour government, though, fell later in the year, after the publication of the Zinoviev letter, which stirred fears of Bolshevism and helped return the Conservatives to power. Baldwin returned to Downing Street in 1924, his ministry marked by diplomatic calm abroad and deep economic unease at home. This unease deepened when Baldwin restored the gold standard in 1925 at its pre-war rate, a decision that made British exports uncompetitive and intensified pressure on heavy industry. This unease exploded into the most dramatic industrial conflict of the century. Crisis in the coal industry triggered the general strike of May 1926, after mine owners demanded wage cuts and longer hours. 3 million workers joined the strike. The government refused to negotiate and mobilized the armed forces. After 8 days, the strike collapsed, though miners fought on until December, when hardship forced their return to work. Meanwhile, a new kind of dictatorship was taking shape in the Soviet Union, following the death of Lenin in January 1924. This saw a fierce struggle for power, with Stalin, using his position as General Secretary of the Communist Party, finally prevailing in 1928. This was after he had outmaneuvered his greatest rival, Trotsky, who was expelled from the party in 1927 and exiled in 1929. He then immediately launched the first 5-year plan, pushing for rapid industrialization, collectivization, and strict internal discipline. With massive dam, canal, and electrification schemes, the industrial landscape was transformed, despite its reckless breakneck speed and its cost in human suffering. Collectivization, too, was important, designed to break the peasants while securing a stable food supply for the cities. Further east, a different struggle for power was unfolding, with China dealing with the aftermath of the collapse of imperial rule. Sun Yat-sen led a nationalist government in the south, and in 1924, the communists under Mao Zedong joined an alliance against the northern warlords. In 1925, Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist new leader, launched the Northern Expedition, going on to capture Beijing in 1928. However, before that, he had come to see the communists as the new threat to his nationalist vision, and so in 1927, he ordered a violent crackdown that killed some 250,000 people. As the world approached the end of 1929, it seemed that the economic and political equilibrium was holding the world together. Britain remained the world's greatest colonial power, and France still held a preeminent position. The USSR and the USA were beginning to stake their claims to superpower status and were also beginning to influence global geopolitics in a way they both shunned earlier in the decade. Japan was extending its influence. China was still in something of a mess, while Europe still dominated the political landscape. And then in October 1929, this fragile balance collapsed. Events following a disaster on the New York Stock Exchange threatened the very existence of capitalism and liberal democracy. The Wall Street crash destroyed the stability of the later 1920s and opened the long, tortuous road towards a new and even costlier world war. American banks stopped lending abroad, cutting off loans that had kept European economies afloat since the war. World trade contracted as demand collapsed, with exports falling by more than a half in just a few years. Nations turned to tariffs and protectionism in desperation, pulling the international economy further apart and accelerating the global slide into depression. In its wake came economic ruin, political fury, and the conditions that would drag the world back into war. The Wall Street crash had shaken the world, and the 1920s were about to show just how deep the damage ran.